Hi, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. Today is Monday, June 21st, 2021. This topic, parental trauma and grief, really came from one of our parent requests. When I put out there for some requests for some new topics, this was the one that came up that I wanted to do first. Some of the other topics we'll be covering in our Q&A upcoming because I didn't know if they would merit an entire hour's worth of time or psychoeducation for me. But I thought this one, I could not spend too much time on this. It would be impossible for me to spend too much time on this. And I asked our watchers, those that are watching in our live audience, I asked parents that have been through this process a little bit longer than some others to share what wisdom, what strength, what lessons have come out of their own processing of their parental grief and trauma. I want to give one really big disclaimer, especially as I get to this first slide tonight. What I'm going to do tonight won't be therapy. Obviously, I'm reading, I'm talking, I'm speaking to a group of people live, and there's some back and forth, some question and answer. But it's really important for me to say that this is not therapy, because in therapy I would be listening. In therapy, I'd be asking you the questions and you would be talking. And that idea that this is not therapy will come up as we go because I think the most important thing with such a heavy topic like parental trauma and grief, like tonight, I think it's important to understand that what we need most is for somebody to hold space for us, to be a witness, for us to be able to tell our story to other people. I was describing that we're going back out there, and in July we have a New York parent support group that we're going to be doing, and might do a couple others along the East Coast. And one of the things I've learned from doing those over the years, I've run hundreds, maybe thousands of parent support groups over the years, and what I've learned from running them is that sometimes people just need to talk. They need to tell their story, especially if they haven't told their story, especially if they're new to the process. So I say that because when I go into kind of techniques and skills and tools about how to deal with it, how to process it, if I were doing that in our therapy session together, I think it could feel very dismissing. It could feel like I was minimizing. And really what I would just be doing to you is holding space and listening and asking questions and empathizing with you. And I'll talk about that as we go along. So the starting point this evening is to say that parental grief and trauma is real. It's not because you have a problem or something's wrong with your thinking. These are real feelings. And yes, we'll talk about a little bit later some ways of shifting our thinking that might be helpful, but it's real in and of itself. And if I were your therapist, if I were a parent mentor to you, if I were your sponsor or sat in a parent support group next to you, the most important thing that I could do is just to sit with you in your grief and your pain, in your unfixable problem. Really, the unfixable problem of being a human. And I don't think, and I talk about this emphatically at other places, I don't think we give enough weight, enough press, enough time to the value, the gift that it is to sit and listen to somebody. One of the things that you learn as you go through the therapeutic process as a participant, not as a therapist, but one of the things you learn as you go through the process and sit on the client's couch, so to speak, is you learn that that there are no solutions to some of this. And then no matter how many times, no matter how many different ways you ask it, it's impossible for us to avoid our pain and our suffering. In fact, in some ways, it is the avoidance of our feelings, our pain, that becomes the mental health symptom. So the antidote, the antidote to the crisis, the problem is to, excuse me, I'm going to cough. Excuse me, I had a tickle and I was fighting it. The antidote to the problem, if mental illness is, in essence, not being present in our own lives and developing symptoms to distract us, and an alternative form of authentic suffering, or an alternative to authentic suffering, as Carl Jung suggests. If those are the problems, then the antidote is to be able to tell our story. So any version of therapy where we're allowed to tell our story, we're allowed to be who we are, we're encouraged to be who we are and feel what we feel, is the key. And there are going to be several things that I say this evening that are going to be important. And the first one that I want to say tonight is, when you have a child that's struggling, or a loved one that's struggling, you have to get extra support. Life is hard anyway. But then when life presents us with pain and suffering in the lives of the people that we love and that we care about, especially our children, we need extra support. So yes, you might have been going along just fine prior to this process. But the fact of the matter is, your child's mental health issues, your loved one's mental health issues, is demanding, it's asking you to go somewhere to get support, to get community, to experience some kind of connection, to let somebody be a witness to your story. And in that is the healing. I know that might sound strange and like an unfinished thought, but telling your story to an empathic, capable other, which psychologists call a container, telling your story to a compassionate, sensitive, caring, non-judgmental other person, that's the recipe for healing. And most of us weren't taught that. And as a therapist, I wish that somebody had spoken to this principle, to this idea, as emphatically as I'm speaking of it to you. It's a strange thing. And like I've said many times, there are hundreds and thousands of therapy programs all over the United States, all over the world. Maybe tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. I don't know the number. But the one thing that we have here to offer you at Evoke is not the expertise from an educated scholar or expert on mental illness, but the story, the compassion from somebody who knows the wounds personally, from somebody who's been through them, and like you, has had to learn to cope with them, or really not survive it, or at least not survive them well. And that's what I have to offer you, with the idea that it's real and it's valid. And I'm going to get into some skills, some principles, and some tools as we go along. I wanted to give voice to some of the parents who have been farther along in the path than some of you, and hear what wisdom and comfort they might have to offer you. So I'll read a few of those to you right now. And Malia, you can kind of drop those as we go. Somebody says, in this process, their key was letting go of controlling, or what they thought parenting was. That was a big lesson for them. Another parent writes, another audience member writes, I am a survivor of domestic violence, and so are my children. Having my son in wilderness therapy and in my process, I can see how I've parented from a place of fear and anxiety. I feel like I've had many more tools to deal with. I feel like I have many more tools to deal with my son, who I'm picking up on Wednesday. I'm excited and nervous. I love that. I think that's one of the things I'm proud of at Evoke, is that somebody can share their process in the middle of their process, that you're recognizing your wounding, you're recognizing its effect on parenting, and that you're better equipped, you're farther along the path, but by no means are completed or finished with it. Someone writes, we have to process our own stuff so we can help our kids process theirs, which means you have to start with your family of origin. I think about all the time how many times people tell me that they meet a therapist that says you can't go backwards. And if that works for some people, more power to them, as they say. I just don't get it. I don't know how we can treat a brain that has been shaped by its environment over years and years. I don't know how we can rewire that, re-engineer that, repair that brain trauma, that brain wounding, without talking about it and going back. So that's not our style here. We believe in going back to move forward. Someone writes, when my son was at Evoke, I grieved. My husband was grieving too. Honestly, the thing that helped me the most were these webinars. Talks with Evoke therapists helped as well. Our son now says that this was one of the least stressful times in his life. Somebody else writes, my trauma informed my own work. Someone writes, DD, those are the letters, the DD, a graduate of Evoke, is now at a young adult residential treatment center and was able to graduate high school there recently. For that, we celebrate. There is still grief associated with the lost hopes and dreams of the expected path, especially amidst prom and graduation parties during the time now here. And starting discussions about when she will come home, the trauma of parenting pre-wilderness has bubbled up big time. Absolutely. Somebody writes, everything I process has been so hard. Thank you. Somebody writes, thanks for doing this topic. My child is transgender, and although I support him and am enjoying getting to know his true self, I feel like I am still grieving the loss of a daughter. I worry my child is picking up on this lingering grief and it is harming him. I would love to hear your thoughts and suggestions around this issue. Somebody else writes, our straight A student went from talking to me every day to trying pot and other drugs. We were not aware of most of it, to using every day. There was loss of time and intimacy that culminated with him disclosing some of his own trauma. This led to an attempted suicide, an intensive outpatient program, residential treatment, and then Evoke. He got kicked out of the other three programs. He's been successful at Evoke 13 weeks in. Loss we as parents have experienced, trust, safety, knowing who our son was, almost having to bury our boy. Time lost, times of sadness, that sense of waiting for the second shoe to fall. We have learned so much along the way from the past two programs, Evoke being one of them. We are approaching life as opportunities to change what doesn't work, grow in our own awareness, and give our son the space he needs to grow and then open up to us and to the world. Thank you for this opportunity to share. And one more before I go into our slides, and then I can take any others that have come in by the end. Thank you for these. My 15-year-old son left Evoke 3 months ago. I've read both your books, listened to tons of your webinars, doing my work every day. I wrote down every traumatic event with my son. I then examined what was really going on through the lens of your talks with us. I spent every day finding myself. I also go to therapy each week. I am also reading all the books you reference. I look at my son now through the lens of love and boundaries, lifelong work of self-care. Thank you, Dr. Reedy, for saving lives, along with your outstanding team. Thank you for sharing it. And like I said, I'll read others when we get to the end. You know, I was saying this to somebody just the other day. I'm just doing for you guys what somebody did for me. And that person who did this for me, who did for me what I'm doing for you, when I thank them for what they've done for me, they say the same thing. I want to give to you the gift. I was going to say I don't know why professors don't teach this in school when they teach therapists how to do their job, but I know why they don't teach what we're talking about here tonight, for the most part, in the way that we're talking about it. They don't teach it because they don't know it, because they haven't done their work, right? Academic success, scholarship, it doesn't require you to do your own work. In fact, for many of us, and I think you can relate to that no matter what field you're in, sometimes our academic or professional success is a defense against feeling. I know for me, I would say this on the most average of days, that work is much easier than home. But when home gets difficult, in the moments, the interactions, the events that are difficult, work is a relief, because even though work is challenging and there are problems to solve, at work things work, right? As my therapist says it, at work you ask for a pencil and they give you a pencil, and at home you ask for a pencil and somebody hands you a banana. And I hope, even though this format of broadcasting webinars, which then become podcasts, which we of course get more listeners to than we actually do the webinars. I know it's not therapy, but I hope you feel in the spirit of this that we're all in this together. That I don't have all the answers or all the solutions to your problems, because for some of them there are no answers and no solutions. It is a loss. That's why in storytelling, or in mythology, the transformation that we're describing tonight, the pain and the grief, is shown as a death. I remember saying this to my therapist 5 or 6 years ago, which led to one of the principles that I write about in the last chapter of The Audacity to Be You, the keys to enlightenment. I said, it feels like life is just a long series of goodbyes. And she nodded and she said, that's the repetition of dying over and over again, right? We grow. Just the other day, I was talking to my 2 children who are in their 20s and saying, it's a miracle that anybody that gets married is able to stay together, because you kind of have to count on growing in similar directions, right? And that's not always guaranteed. And even though in a moment you can be very compatible, if somebody decides to grow in a different way, they might not be compatible. There can be losses. And when children go through these things, the struggles, the crises, the pain, the losses, the events in our lives, they ask us for something that we don't have often, something we have to develop. And so for this next part of your journey, as it were, you're going to have to develop some new sensibilities, some new ways of being, some new ideas, some new skills, at least, if not in a deeper sense, a deeper capacity. So beyond my empathic space for you, I'll talk now about the intellectual part of this, which can guide you, which can give you help. This is the hardest thing. I tried to write this out in preparation for today, but I couldn't really write it out, so I'm going to try to say it. Part of what parents experience in this process is a trauma on top of a trauma. In other words, there's a lot of evidence that suggests that people that suffer from PTSD, for example, veterans who come home from war who suffer from PTSD, the ones who suffer from it more as a mental health disorder had more trauma in their background. There was a higher incidence of childhood abuse among veterans who left war with a diagnosis of PTSD. I learned that in graduate school because my professor, this was her area of focus, was PTSD and trauma. I think that's profound. So part of what you're experiencing is trauma on top of trauma. And the thing that's insidious about it is the trauma that you experienced previous to this experience with your child was unnoticed by you, unrecognized by you. It didn't seem that bad or that profound, but this trauma can expose it, can highlight it. Another way of thinking about it, or perhaps another aspect of it, is the trauma you're experiencing with your child is on top of your own attachment issues. I'm going to talk about this. I hope it's as simply and as clearly as I can later, the relationship between secure attachment experience and resiliency. But what trauma exposes is our attachment wounding. The less grounded we are, the more we're going to be affected by trauma. That's why many of you will report that as you do this work and things happen, you're more prepared for them. I have clients who tell me because of the invitation, the unconscious invitation from their child to get into this work, it prepared them for what was happening now, which in some ways was worse than the original event, the original incident. So there's something about healthy attachment that creates a base for us, a base to operate from. We carry around something in us that builds a resilience. And not all of us have the same level of resilience. Some of us are more fragile than others. Nobody's perfect, and nobody's really a complete disaster. We're all somewhere in between. So I'll talk about that tonight. When we are invited or shoved into this place in our lives, we develop skills, resources, and we start to make the shift, I'm going to call it, into a new way of thinking about things, a new way of being in relationship to ourselves, a new way of relating to our children, and a new way of relating to their problem. That's really what I've attempted to do in both of my books, is to help describe the shift, what it sounds like and what it looks like. That's why I tell stories in the books, because that's the best way to illustrate it. It's really hard to describe it just from a step-by-step process, but I can show you what it looks like. I can't tell you how to paint at some point, but I can tell you what it feels like. I use metaphor and story to teach. We listen to the stories of others who have navigated it. That's why we go to parent support groups. That's why I asked you at the outset of this meeting to share some of your wisdom. We go to Al-Anon meetings. We go to Codependence Anonymous meetings. We go to Families Anonymous meetings. We go to NAMI meetings in our local area. We find other people, refuge recovery. We find other people that are farther along the path than us, or might not be in the hole that we're in that particular Tuesday. And we listen to their lives. We listen to the stories from their lives. And then there's going to be a day when you tell your story, and that becomes somebody else's beacon of hope. So we all want to protect ourselves from judgment, right? From being judged by others, and therefore we kind of spend a lot of energy hiding our pain. But that's the very thing that prevents us from healing. That's why so many people are spending so much time and energy talking about destigmatizing mental health issues. Because the more we can talk about it, like Fred Rogers said, anything that is mentionable is manageable. And Fred Rogers was the best example in popular culture, albeit many, many years ago. Mr. Rogers was one of the best examples of, the pain doesn't have anywhere to go. You just have to get through it. The grief doesn't have anywhere to go. You just have to get through it. And the way that we do that is in company of others, in the company of others. It's really hard to do alone. I remember when I was trying to teach the staff this in a certain group I was working in and training in a few years ago. And one of the staff was confused because he was a very nice guy, very charismatic, friendly. The clients loved him. And I was putting a pause on everybody giving solutions in a particular group where a young man was sharing about some trauma in the form of anger and rage he had at one of his parents. And after he told the story and everybody was trying to give him advice in a gentle way about how to get over it, I was encouraging them to relate to him if they could. It took them a long time to understand what I meant by that. But then we had a discussion afterwards where the staff pulled me aside and said, Brad, when's the time for teaching? When's the time for talking? And I said, I don't know when, exactly in terms of time, but I know it's not the first time somebody tells their trauma story. That's for sure. I know it's not when somebody's nervous system is upregulated, right? Is charged. So there'd be a moment when his nervous system relaxes, when he feels safe. And then one of your friendly little analogies might hit the spot. And the staff said something to me interesting as an example of showing that listening wasn't enough. He said if two children grew up in a home and both had been abused and told each other about it, it really wouldn't make a difference. And I said, I couldn't disagree with you more. To have somebody in your childhood that was an empathic witness to your story might be the greatest gift a child could ever receive. I mean, it would be better if it was an adult, right? There are levels of how it could be better, but that definitely is better than having no one. And so part of what we're trying to create at Evoke with these even is a community, a place to come, a place to be safe, a place to live your story and have it not be judged and not have to do it alone. I think the most important thing that we do, that we seek out in terms of for professional resources, but also can be lay folks like your group members in an Al-Anon group or an AA group or whatever, is sitting with a container, sitting with somebody who can listen to you, sitting with somebody who doesn't have answers or advice or suggestions or analogies, unless you ask for them or you want them. But they're able to resist the urge to make it better. Because when you have the kind of losses that even you've described here in your text chat, that's real. Those are real losses. And there's no fixing that. If you lose somebody to death, that doesn't get fixed. That gets, at best, incorporated and becomes a part of you, a part of your depth. The effects of trauma, shame, of course, I'm bad, addiction, right? Attempts to self-medicate that then become a pattern because we don't want to be present in our own lives, in our own pain. Isolation, poor reality testing. I'm becoming aware of that as I've been thinking, and I'm always thinking and writing and teaching. And I've been thinking about a lot later about this idea that without being with other people and listening to their stories and telling our stories, we really do have poor reality testing. We think that our lives are the truth, that our upbringing was normal. There's no normal upbringing. There's just your upbringing, which was one possibility amidst an infinite number of possibilities. So we learn about reality by seeing and experiencing different perspectives, by hearing other people's stories, by being able to tell ours. I can remember more than once saying something to my therapist as if it was just universally true. And having her say to me, that's not my experience. And I thought she was joking or slow. This is the same therapist that some of you have heard speak on our broadcast, Jamie Gill, JD Gill. I thought she was slow or some kind of technique. But she was just saying, I have a different experience than you do. And when I was able to realize that, I've had many young men tell me when I teach that it's possible to be loved even though you make lots and lots of mistakes, and the story is longer than that. I've had many young men say to me, but nobody's like that, Brad. That's not a real thing. And all I say to them is, I used to think so too. I really did. I grew up in a family where my mistakes, especially the dangerous or the ones that led to other people suffering, meant that something was wrong or bad about me, that I was unlovable. And I didn't know that that wasn't true until I sat with somebody who felt differently, who responded to me differently. There's this unresolved grief and mourning in our trauma, our unresolved trauma sometimes, that gets stirred up or triggered or amplified by new trauma. We can have developmental delays. That's why some people might express a lack of trust in the world. Some people might have a lack of confidence, or what we would call in psychology self-efficacy. Those are all examples in areas in our life where we may have experienced trauma, and it wouldn't be visible to you. It wouldn't be conscious. Post-traumatic stress responses, which are responses that are disproportionate to the event in front of you. Mood disorders can evolve out of a trauma experience. Trauma responses essentially lead to inflexible and rigid and repetitive responses, right? Knee-jerk, reactive responses. That's a trauma response. Anything except for curious, compassionate, patient. In essence, if I'm going to simplify it, anything but those is a trauma response. It's highly emotional. There's a phrase that they use in 12-step circles sometimes that says, if it's historical, it's hysterical. Excuse me. If it's hysterical, it's historical. I guess it would be true the other way sometimes too. But if it's hysterical, which means if you're having a big reaction, if you think somebody's overreacting, they're not. They might be overreacting to the specific situation, but what they're trying to tell you unconsciously is, I have a trauma that I haven't dealt with. And this echoes it, this mirrors it, this triggers it. And we all have those. Everybody listening to me, no matter how functional you are, has responded to things bigger than needed, bigger than what was needed or required at the time. That is because it reminds you of something else. It taps into your own history. The response is disproportionate to the event. I used the example just the other day of like coming home from a war where there's gunshots and fire and explosions, then hearing a car backfiring, right? And hitting the deck and bringing everybody in the family down with you. I have a hypervigilance, right? I'm always scanning my environment. Makes me highly functional. It also happens to raise my blood pressure and creates poor heart health, right? And stresses the hell out of my family. I asked my therapist one time when I was learning about the word container, because it's such an odd word. I said, what is a container? And she said something I just said a few moments ago. She said, a container is patient and compassionate and non-judgmental and curious. Anything else is not containing. And it's a continuum. And when we have trauma, we're not able to contain other people. One of the things I've learned, I count myself so lucky that I chose the profession that I chose, is to do well at my job. I've had to deal with my trauma. And when I was younger, I wasn't as good as I am today. And hopefully I live a long time and keep practicing this for a long time, and I'll be better in another 10 or 20 or 30 years. My unresolved trauma will prevent me from listening to you in an empathic, non-judgmental way. I wrote something the other day on my social media that said, it was to therapists. I said, to therapists, if you are angry or frustrated, anxious or disappointed with your clients, you have lost contact with them. I used to justifying it, saying it was a normal reaction. But it was just normal in reference to my mother, to the context that I grew up in. Southern California in the 1970s and 80s in Irvine. Right? That was what it was. Wasn't an ideal to strive for. And I hadn't yet met a therapist who could hold space for me, who could be not anxious to fix me, but more eager to find me. There's an idea in the literature that's called response flexibility. And that means you're able to respond to events, stimulus, stressors in a flexible, creative, not a knee-jerk way. And your ability to develop response flexibility comes out of your work. Or if your how well we do this really will come out of our own attachment experience. If we had a secure attachment, we'll have more of this because we'll be calm. If we had a less secure attachment and more trauma, we'll be more reactive, more knee-jerk. So response flexibility is intentional versus being primitive, unfiltered. Think before you speak kind of ideas. Being able to respond in flexible ways is one of the biggest challenges of being a parent. Response flexibility is the ability of the mind to sort through a wide variety of mental processes, such as impulses, ideas, and feelings, and come up with a thoughtful, non-automatic response. Response flexibility is the opposite of a knee-jerk reaction. It involves the capacity to delay gratification and to inhibit impulse behaviors. This ability is a cornerstone of emotional maturity and compassionate relationships. Some of this part of the broadcast comes from Daniel Siegel and Mary Hartzell and their book, Parenting from the Inside Out. This relates to resiliency, right? Which is kind of the opposite of well, at least it's the foundation for being able to deal with traumatic events in a non-traumatic way. Not being so triggered by them or overwhelmed by them. Research suggests that children who have had a positive connection in life have a source of resilience for dealing with life's challenges. That seems pretty simple, but it's a big deal. I shared just last week when we were talking about trauma in our children, that if we had somebody growing up that could see us, really see us, really hold space for us, somebody that was consistent, we would have a better foundation, a more solid foundation for dealing with life stressors, and we would automatically transfer that onto our children. But to the extent that we didn't have that, because it's a continuum, right? We're not so sure. The ground's not so solid. There's no safety net or backstop. And we must remain on guard. And that is a trauma response, a trauma brain. Research in the field of child development has demonstrated that a child's security of attachment to parents is very strongly connected to the parents' understanding of their own early life experiences. In other words, and I'll talk about this step by step a little bit later, if you do your work, I'll explain this the best I can later, but I'm just going to make it as a statement now. If you do your work, you'll be able to provide your child with an experience, an attachment experience, a relationship that will help them in their development. So their resiliency, in other words, depends in part, in fact, in large part, on how much you've made sense out of your life, your early life experiences. Research has clearly demonstrated that our child's attachment to us will be influenced by what happened to us when we were young if we do not come to process those experiences. Isn't that incredible? And even Siegel and Hartzell go on to say, and even if we have come to understand ourselves well, our children will still make their own journey through life. Although we may supply them with a secure foundation through our own deeper self-understanding, our role as parents serves to support our children's development, not guarantee its outcome. And what Siegel and Hartzell are trying to explain here is, because this is what our healing will teach us, will teach you. This is how your healing will give you comfort. As you heal and evolve, you start to realize I'm here to support my child, but I can't guarantee or control outcomes. Controlling outcomes is a trauma response. It's, in other words, and I say this to parents, when I get enough money in the bank with them and they let me say this, I'll say to them, your mental health issue is affecting your child. I don't say that to beat up on you or to be mean, but just to make you aware. And what I'm saying is, what's implied in that statement is you have to go sort it out with somebody. And your early life experience has nothing to do with your child. It happened before they were born, but it's affecting them today. And at the end of the day, I mean, that's what the first person tonight, when I asked for comments, he or she mentioned that they learned to let go, or what they thought parenting was. You shift ever so slightly. You learn things like, I can love, but I can't make my child feel loved. I can have a healthy boundary, but I can't control for outcomes with my children. And all sorts of implications come out of that kind of letting go. We start to tell the truth more, because lying is an attempt to control people, right? What they think and feel. But when we let go of control, we tell the truth more often. When we let go of control, we have clearer boundaries, more confident boundaries, because we're not weighing the options about how somebody's going to respond or not, which is really, really hard to do when your child's safety is on the line. So again, because your child's safety is on the line, you got to go get help. You got to go get help. I'm not saying that because I'm picking on you. I'm saying it because it's the only way. I think many people know that the top and front parts of the brain are the part of the brain that can reason, that can be creative. And the middle and bottom part of the brain is the fight or the flight center, right? The emotional center, the non-rational part of our brain, but the one that keeps us alive in survival and in crises and in moments of stress or distress. So the high road that Siegel and Hartz will talk about, the high road and the low road, refer to that. There's no judgment about good or bad. It's just high versus low when speaking of the brain as we stand erect. The high road is a form of processing information that involves higher rational, reflective thought processes of the mind. High road processing allows for mindfulness, flexibility in our responses, and an integrating sense of self-awareness. The high road involves the prefrontal cortex in this process. Daniel Siegel, one of the authors of the book that I'm referencing, he uses his hand as an example. The thumb, if you make a fist, the thumb is that emotional part of the brain, the limbic system. And the top part of the brain that wraps around it and in front is the prefrontal cortex. And he points out that when we are under stress, we flip our lid. Literally, the top of your brain stops functioning and your body dedicates resources and chemistry to keep you alive from the snake that's going to bite you, or the car that's going to run into you, or the bear that's chasing you. The low road processing is a low mode processing that involves shutting down of the higher processes of the mind and leaves the individual in a state of intense emotions, impulsive reactions, rigid and repetitive responses, and lacking in self-reflection and the consideration of another's point of view. Involvement of the prefrontal cortex is shut off when one is on the low road. I had low road reactions to my children a few times this weekend. I do throughout the week. I asked my son a question. I wanted his thoughts on something, and when I didn't like, and it was just a thought discussion. There was no behavior event. I asked him what he thought about something going on in culture. And when he started to respond, I was triggered. And I shut him down, and I thought, that's ridiculous. You're being ridiculous, Brad. And I came back and said I was sorry, told him vaguely where it came from, and said, it's not your fault. I'll try to do better. It's silly for me to ask you your opinion about some issue, some current event issue, and then to jump on you when you don't give me the answer that I like. These low-roaded responses, these intense emotions can lead you to have knee-jerk reactions instead of thoughtful responses. When you're feeling stressed or find yourself in situations with your child that trigger past unresolved issues, your mind may shut off and become inflexible. No parents really feel good about themselves or what they may have done to their children in this low-road state of mind. And yet, when parents have not reflected on their own experiences, they can return again and again to the low road. So you get treatment for it. You read, you go to therapy, you go to support groups. You learn to understand the ununderstandable. You learn to see past the triggering symptoms and into the wound or the trauma that the other one is exhibiting. And you learn that you have to have limits because you're human, but you learn a compassionate, patient position with your child. And then we do things for your children along with this that help them deal with their trauma and also help them understand your trauma. Okay. Here are the 5 slides that I made up that I'm going to read to you that I think summarize, I think, a trauma and attachment informed ideas about resiliency, about how to deal with our trauma, our grief, and our pain. We know 2 things. Number 1, this is kind of a summary of what we've talked about so far. We know that a healthy or a secure attachment is the most significant contribution that one can make to a child's development and their mental health. A healthy, secure attachment is the greatest contribution we can make to a child's mental health. And number 2, that the best predictor of one's ability to provide a healthy or secure attachment is in how much work you've done to make sense out of your own childhood. The research is complete. I should say replete with it. Exhaustive on the subject. Research is never complete because we're always studying and learning and kind of filling in and changing a little bit. But at this point, the research is clear. Healthy attachment's the best thing we can do. See, it's not if your child was abused. It's not if your child had a learning disability. I haven't told this story in many years. And this happened in my first year of being a wilderness therapist in 1996. I welcomed parents to a parent meeting that I was hosting. And one set of parents were the grandparents because the parents weren't involved. The father had left the young man before, or in infancy, or before he could recall his father. And the mother had died. Actually, the son found the mother dead of a drug overdose in her bed. And the parents had taken custody and taken to raising this young man. He'd been hit by a car while walking across a crosswalk, excuse me. And because of that, had many surgeries and walked with a limp and had pins, and you could see the scars on his legs. And as the grandparents were going through this, it was actually just the grandmother, I remember now, because the grandfather had passed away too. So she told that story. And after listing all of these traumas, the grandmother said and turned to the next set of parents and said, so that's why my son is here. My grandson is here. Why is your child here? And I said, that's not exactly why your grandson is here. Your grandson is here because he's not able to cope with those things, which is a lot. Maybe nobody could. And so what we're trying to do is give him the psychological resource or resources to be able to deal with the pain and the trauma in his life. We won't be able to take away those events. Those will never change. but we can help to co-create something in the child where they can make sense out of those things. They can integrate those things. Those things will now become, they will evolve into part of this child's character and strength and gifts. Going on to describe healthy attachment. A secure attachment is defined by two things: providing the child a sense of safety and security, a stable house, responding to the child's needs, making sure they're not suffering or in pain or in distress, right? A secure and safe house situation. Number two, the child and their feelings and their inner world is welcomed. It's felt and empathized with and welcomed by the parent. So a sense of safety and security, and the child's inner world is welcomed. That's a healthy attachment. It's important to note that the quality of your childhood, this is the biggest, most common retort when I teach this. It's really important to understand this. The quality of your childhood doesn't predict whether you can provide a healthy attachment for your child. So saying I had a pretty good childhood or normal childhood, although, as I will tell you, we'll see, maybe therapy can fix that. But even if it were true, that's not a predictor of your ability to provide your child with a healthy attachment experience. You can have a relatively good childhood, but if you haven't done the work to sort it out, you'll be limited in your ability to parent. So what's the implication of all of this? Do your work. And what does a healthy attachment look like? I'm oversimplifying. I am oversimplifying. But I wrote this in The Audacity to Be You. It's one of my most commonly shared slides or things that I've written. The examples are things like, thank you for telling me. Tell me more. I appreciate knowing. Glad you told me. Thanks. That sounds hard. I'm sorry. I'm here. I'm listening. You're not alone. That makes sense. Is there anything I can do? You must have a good reason. I'd like to understand. What can I do to support you? I can relate. That's what it sounds like. That's what it sounds like when somebody's providing a healthy attachment experience for a child. What it doesn't sound like is, that's silly. You're overreacting. You're too sensitive, or just you're sensitive. You're scaring me. You're being selfish. You should, and then fill in the blank. Don't pay them any mind. They're just jealous. Ignore them. You'll get over it. Look on the bright side. Why did you do that? Have you tried X, Y, or Z? That's just your depression, your insecurity, your anxiety, your narcissism, your defense, your rationalization, justification. Right? And how often do we do those things? Even my staff who are attempting to help heal children are inclined to respond with, let me give you some answers, some solutions. Let me fix it. First things first, I teach them, provide a safe container first. And let the child tell us. Let the child discover it. And let us help the child access the part of their brain that does all the wonderful creative problem solving by lowering their nervous system's regulation. Let's let them feel safe so they don't feel the need to justify. I talk with a lot of parents who try to tell me to justify what they do. And my response is, you don't have to justify. It's okay. We all make mistakes. We all struggle every day. In fact, the more you do this work, the more you do work, the more you'll realize how much you're screwing up. The less work that you do, you'll probably think you're pretty good at this. You probably think you have a pretty good handle. The things were good enough. The more work, you realize you're a disaster, and it's relieving. And you can apologize and lose battles, but winning the war. You can do all kinds of wonderful creative things when you realize that you're a disaster. Trauma is inescapable, but healing is elective. Knowing your trauma response and discovering your trauma are your responsibilities during this process. There's no such thing as an overreaction in the way that we've described it today. And a trauma response is being unkind to yourself. So developing a kind response, and a kind response to yourself is a healed psyche, a healed mind, a healed person. But of course, we were taught both by word and by reaction, by our early environments, by our parents, that our mistakes were really scary, really upsetting. Finding safe places and creating competing experiences for the ones that you have earlier. I think this is the last big bomb that I'm gonna say to you, but is this. You have to find a safe person. I don't care if they use EMDR. I don't care if they use DBT therapy, CBT therapy, ACT therapy, internal family systems, emotionally focused therapy, the reality therapy. The list goes on and on. I don't care what model they use. If they're anxious or eager to fix you, there's a problem. If they're patient and they meet you where you're at, you got somebody. If they can sit with you in your unsolvable problems, they can sit with you patiently, lovingly in your unsolvable problems, you got a good one. If they can say, I'm sorry when they make a mistake or when you express hurt or frustration with their process, you got a good one. If all of you is welcomed, if all of your feelings are welcomed in the session or the discussion, you got a good one. That's why in Al-Anon and 12-step groups, there's a principle of practice of no crosstalk. Don't talk to each other during the meeting. It is a structural piece of the 12-step work that prevents people from doing anything but listening. Find safe places to create competing experiences for yourself. You guys, I'm with you. I suspect, I don't know this for sure, but I suspect I have more experience or education and treatment than most everybody listening. That might not be true of some, of course, but I expect I'm in the top 1% of the average person I've spent my life thinking and studying about this stuff, practicing this, and I make mistakes every day. I'm not absolving myself of responsibility and accountability. I'm doing actually just the opposite. I've worked through the shame enough so that I can see it. I can see my mistakes and they don't threaten me. I had to apologize, like I said, to my children, my family, a few times this week, and I'm sure it'll be a few more times this week, and the week after, and the week after. Anxiety is a trauma response. Anxiety is a trauma response. It's real. It deserves nurture and care. Thich Nhat Hanh, the Buddhist monk, says we should come to our anxiety and our depression like we do to a little child and say to it, dear one, I'm here for you. I'm listening. And what I am teaching you is the way to do that to yourself is somebody's got to do it to you first. Somebody's got to do it to you first. I learned to sit with myself compassionately because I had a remarkable, gifted therapist who sat with me for years through my many, many struggles, some of which had simple answers, but I just couldn't step through the door. I was too scared. And she sat with me lovingly and patiently. And because she sat with me then, I can sit with me more now. And I can sit with you more now. It takes years to improve your response flexibility to heal your trauma. But the hope and the energy comes when knowing that it's the project. What I'm proud of at Evoke is that we have a program that meets parents, not just students, everybody. I expect everybody to do that in the treatment field, although they don't. But we respond to parents with the same level of compassion that we have for your children. And know that if you make this much, just holding my fingers just a half an inch away from each other, if you make this much progress, you've done something remarkable, because this is hard work to undo what was done to us. Learning to own your own limitations. I won't go with this one for a long time, but you have limits. It's okay. You can't love your children. You can't love your spouse until you learn to love yourself and have boundaries. I posted this just the other day. That the first ingredient in connection, the first ingredient in intimacy is a sense of self and boundaries. You can't love without healthy boundaries. Or I'll say, you can only love to the extent that you have a healthy self and boundaries. Because then you're just nobody. If you don't have boundaries in the self, you're just nothing. You're not a person. You're just an empty vessel with no thoughts or feelings or passions. So we as parents learn to own our limitations and learn to say, like I said, my first book, when I had a working title for the journey of the heroic parent, it was called Parenting Difficult Children. That was the working title. I knew that wasn't going to be the title. And it came to me as that was the Word document that I was working on for a couple of years. The child's just the child. They're just being them. That's not the issue. And some are harder than others. Neurologically atypical kids are harder. Kids that have a different neurology than you are harder. Kids that are different than you are harder. Kids that have mental health issues are difficult and challenging to us. So then it's incumbent upon us to go develop more capacity. And the result of your work is greater peace and joy and confidence and comfort. It's not well-behaved children, but it's peace, serenity, and confidence. Not confidence that everything's going to work out exactly the way that you want it, but confidence that however it works out, you'll be okay. And when you arrive at that place, when you make that shift, what a great burden off your child's shoulders. No longer then are they the cause of ruining the life of the person who loves them the most. No longer are they responsible for taking care of your peace and serenity and happiness and joy and well-being. When they see and experience you taking care of you, they are unburdened. If there's one thing that our children who struggle with mental health and addiction issues need, it is less of a burden from us. They don't need to carry us around. All right, I'm happy to read one or two more before I wrap up. Actually, I'm 8 minutes over. So I'm going to read those on our Q&A next time. All right, my book, The Journey of the Heroic Parent and the Audacity to Be You, are available on Amazon and Audible. For parent support groups for wilderness current families and alumni families, the next one is June 24th at 6:30 p.m. And if you are an intensives alumni, it's July 13th at 6 p.m. Mountain Time. Just email malia@evoketherapy.com for information, find out how to register. If you want to do a deep dive into your own work, you can contact intensives@evoketherapy.com. We have upcoming sessions in August, September, October. We also have online options for you if travel and finances are limited. An online option is a fantastic way to do a deep dive into your own work. What I talked about tonight, that's what these intensives focus on, is you and your work and your trauma. And then part two, or the second half of it, is how does that relate to the relationships you're experiencing, to the situations in your today life. We have a returning to you in person in October that I'll be running. We have parent coaching available. So if above and beyond Evoke's programming, if you want virtual therapeutic coaching, you can contact Travis@evoketherapy.com. Go to our website to find out more about that. Therapists that are trained in this model, attachment-based therapy model. We have pursuit trips for families and adults. Think sober fun, anywhere from 3 to 30 days, in between programs, after programs, separate from programs. We ask all current parents to go to 6 12-step support groups, any combination of Al-Anon, CODIS, Families Anonymous, Adult Children Refuge Recovery, or NAMI.org are great resources. All of these broadcasts are available on your podcast app. Just go to your favorite podcast platform and search Finding You in Evoke Therapy Podcast, or go to soundcloud.com on your computer. On Twitter and Instagram, you can find us using the handle @EvokeTherapy. And on Instagram, you can also find @EvokeTherapy Intensives. On Facebook, you can find us by searching Evoke Therapy Programs or Evoke Therapy Intensives. Also, you can find my handle on Instagram @drbradreedy.com. You also can go to our Evoke Therapy blog page where we have new content each week. I had a sudden trip that I'm taking out of town this week, so I'm pushing back Wednesday's webinar will be next Monday, the 28th at 6:30 p.m. It'll be a Q&A. So whatever's left over from tonight, comments or questions, I'll read those in our Q&A on Monday evening. Thank you for joining us. I hope this is helpful. Even though this wasn't me listening, I hope it gives you some sense, some feeling that you're not alone and that we're in this together. Thank you for joining us. And on behalf of the people that love you, thank you for doing your work. Take care, folks. Talk to you later. See you Monday the 28th at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. Bye-bye.